Did I? Okay, that's working. Okay. This is one of our vets that's been in our club for forever, right?
Right. So,
It's about right.
yeah, maybe a little closer.
Okay.
Okay, just tell you how you got in, when you got into the,
Well, let's go back in time where we're going to Marseille, and I was involved with that. It started in the U.S. My division was being deployed to Europe. So we ended up at Camp Kilda, New Jersey, and from there we went to, a few days we went to, I believe it was Hoboken, New Jersey, and there we got our cruise ship. It was very eventful. It was early in the morning when we got there, and I had, my brother-in-law was a captain in the transportation corps in New York, and he was able to visit me and my unit before we got on board the ship. So Jack Murphy wished me well, and I got on to the troop ship called the SS George Washington, which was a ship that was taken over by the U.S. It was a German-owned ship in World War I, but it happened to be in a New York port during the war, so the government took it over. It eventually became a luxury liner going back and forth across the Atlantic, and in World War II, it became a troop carrier. Now, a troop carrier, a troop ship, was not the cruise ship that we have today. For one thing, your accommodation was a bunk that was capable of taking your duffel bag, your rifle, and all your personal equipment with you. And about 2 inches from your nose was the guy above you, because we were stacked 6 high in this place. So it wasn't very comfortable, and I tried very hard to spend most of my time on deck because I was really seasick most of the time. However, Jock Murphy, my brother-in-law, was able to tell me where we were going. Now, everyone assumed that we were going to England like all of the other deployed ships, troops from the U.S. And he said, no, you are going to Marseille through the Gibraltar, past Gibraltar into the Mediterranean and into Marseille. But he swore me to secrecy. So I was the only GI on this troop ship knowing where we were going, and obviously I didn't tell anyone. So we had a lovely crossing with no big problem, except we went through a major storm, but no attacks by German submarines, which was very good. We arrived in Marseille at night, and I was able to see what was left of the port. It was a disaster. There were sunken ships all over the place. And we had to embark and get into the town. So what they did, they threw cargo nets off the side of the ship, and they allowed us to climb down the cargo nets into ducts, which was sitting along the bottom at water's edge. And we jumped into the ducts, and the ducts took us to dry land in the city of Marseille. Of course, we never climbed a cargo net before, so they gave us quick instructions. The instructions were simply this: the vertical ropes you use for your hands and the horizontal ropes you put your feet on, and you climb down the side of this big, it must have been 40 feet off the water. Anyhow, it was fun. Well, we got into the ducks, and we made our way to land in Marseille. Now, it's late at night, and we have all our gear, and we're marching through the blacked out city of Marseille. And we're going along, and I have some guys in front of me, and this one guy keeps on saying, volley. Heck, I forget it now. But in French, he asks the French people in the doorways, how are you? And they would say, je vais bien, I am well. And after about 20 minutes of this, I said, what in the hell are you doing? And he said, I want to know if they know the right answer. Anyhow, that was Marseille, and we ended up in the outskirts of Marseille in an area where they told us to pitch our pub tents, and we're going to stay here for a few days. Now, it's very muddy and very wet, and it was not very comfortable. But we were the first U.S. troops to land in Marseille. So the engineers hadn't had time to prepare for this influx of thousands of hungry guys. And they were building accommodations for kitchens and barracks and everything else, because we were the first ones that landed in Marseille to make the trip up to the north. Well, we stayed there for, it probably was 2 or 3 days, and then finally we had a convoy of trucks that took us north to the battle line. And it was very interesting as we approached the end of our line, because we could hear shell fire in the distance. And that was sort of ominous. It was sort of a wake-up call that we were getting close to what we were about to do. And anyhow, so we made this trip. It took about 2 days to get to the line, and we ended up in a small town called Bertrechance in France. And we stayed in Bertrechance for a day or two, and we finally got our orders to continue the march into the Vosges Mountains. And I recall single line, 10 spaces apart. You didn't march in columns. You had to march together in a staggered formation. So if a shell came in, it would only take out a few people rather than a whole company. And we marched into the woods, and we were on the attack in the Vosges Mountains, and we didn't know where we were going, what we were going to do. I was with a mortar section, which was like rear echelon with the rest of the company. I was with a rifle company in the 397th Infantry. And anyhow, we're walking through the woods, and I remember going in single line, and it was snowing. Well, the snow had fallen, so it was an inch or so on the ground, and I just followed the steps of the guys in front of me. And I noticed as I got to a point, it made a loop around and back again in line. There was a dead German sitting over here, which was the first one we saw. And everybody sort of gave it a little leeway as we went around this guy and on our way. Well, we kept going, and we were told to go up a certain place, and we did. And the sergeant said, okay, everybody stop and dig in for a while. So stopped with my group and I started to dig a slit trench. And I had a very comfortable looking slit trench. It was the length of my body and maybe a foot or two deep. I finished. I was stooping near the end of the slit trench, and my buddy Frank Presser came over, and he stooped down and we started to chat. I said, "Come on, Frank, where's your hole?" And he said, "Ah, the hell with the hole." He was a very very funny guy. So he didn't decide. I think he might have noticed that I had a really good-looking hole, so he came to join me. Anyhow, as it turned out, he was sitting scooting near the end of my hole. We were chatting, and all at once I heard something coming in, and I dove into the hole, and Frank didn't move fast enough, and I got in, and 2 or 3 rounds exploded above my head, and everything got quiet, and a good friend of mine, McAfee, came over, and he said, "How you doing?" And I said, "I think I'm hit." And he said, "Yeah, I can see it." And I said to myself, "God, I didn't know I was hit." And then I started to worry. Anyhow, he said, "Stay there, and the medics will come over and take care of you." I said, "Okay." So I didn't know what was going on, so I stayed there, and this was late afternoon, and it started to get dark. I'm still staying there, and I spent the night in the hole, and the next morning, I decided it was time to take inventory of what's going on, and I found out I could get up, I could walk, but I couldn't use my right arm. And Frank Presser had been sort of sitting there all night with me. He was killed. And I got out of the hole, and I thought to myself, well, if I'm taken prisoner, they probably won't feed me. So the first thing I did, I took out my K rations, and the one I had was lunch. Now a K ration is yuck, especially lunch. Lunch is something the size of a sard, well, around about the size of a hockey puck of processed yellow cheese, which is hard to chew or eat. It's like it's American cheese, only a supply that you usually have a thin slice and you have real cheese, that's great. But just plain American cheese and crackers is hard to take. But I said to myself, I better eat it, because if I'm captured, the Germans will take this away, and who knows when my next meal will come. So I ate the processed cheese. I put my raincoat on because it was raining, and I said goodbye to Frank, and I tried to find my way back to my lines. And I wasn't sure exactly where I was or where they were, but it was very quiet. So I did all the good things that I learned in basic training. I stopped at a stream, filled my canteen, put the tablets in the canteen to kill the bug. Remembered that if you pass a road or a path in the woods, run past quickly because typically the machine gunners sit their guns at the end of the path, and they have a clear view down the path, and they can take you out as you pass by. So I did all those wonderful things, and I kept on walking, and got into the woods in a few hours. I don't know how long, but I heard engine noises, and I couldn't see through the woods what the noises came from. They were either, well, it could have been German tanks or American trucks or God knows what all. So I carefully looked through the trees and got as close as I could. And I looked down, and my goodness, there was a line of 2.5-ton American trucks just revving their engines up. So I went down, and I told one of the drivers when he was leaving, to drop me off at an aid station. And I jumped into the back of the truck, and I'm standing there, and we're driving down this muddy road through the woods. And lo and behold, a couple of guys were walking along the side, and I recognized one of them. That was McKisson, one of the guys from my squad. So I yelled out, "Hey, McKisson!" And he looked up, and he didn't recognize me, because I must have been very dirty, I don't know. Anyhow, he didn't recognize me, so I shouted my name, and then he recognized me, and we waved, and I went off, and I got to an aid station, and they found that I had a shrapnel wound in my right shoulder, and that's why I couldn't move my arm. But it wasn't really bad because it didn't hit any important piece of me. It just went through, and the shrapnel actually stuck in my sweater. Now, I was dressed very warmly because it was very inclement in the Vosges Mountains. So I had a underwear, sweater, my shirt, my jacket, and so forth. And when I was hit, I was laying on my stomach. So the shrapnel went through me, and it stuck in my sweater. And so when the medic looked at me, he dropped this thing in my hand. He said, "This is the thing that did it." I said, "Thanks." I put it in my pocket. Anyhow, I went from there back to an evacuation hospital for one night, and the nurses loaded me up with penicillin and stuff like that. And a day or two later, they transferred me to a general hospital where I stayed for the next month or so. And that's it.
Hang on a second before you get into coming back. Ed was talking, he was in a infantry company. Now, a company will have 3 platoons of riflemen. And you see the rifle badge, those guys are probably the heroes of World War II, because that meant they fought, they were in the front lines. So he was in a rifle company, and there were 3 platoons of riflemen, and then a heavy weapons, which he was a mortar, you were a sergeant. And he was in charge, you're private, you were in charge of the section?
I was a gunner of the
A mortar squad, you had 3 mortars.
Yeah.
So in this group then, so you have these 120 riflemen, and then you're gonna have these 3 mortars, and usually 2 machine guns, light machine guns, the ones without the canister of water. So that would have been, that makes up the company, that was company commander. So he was in that group, but when he was wounded, was it a tree burst that got you? When the Germans would shell, what it is in mountainous regions or, well, tree regions, the shells would hit the top of the trees, and then the shells explode. So what you have, you've got, it's overhead, but the shrapnel's coming down from the shell, but you also have any kind of splinters and things coming from the trees. So it's very destructive. You've got extra destructive power because they're hitting the trees, so that's coming down. And you always hear about the guys dig their foxhole because you never know, and your friend was a good example of not digging it, and it killed him. So anyway, we'll go back now. We'll finish up and then we'll ask for a few questions here. But Ed, now you're in the hospital, and then you end up continuing on.
Yeah. Well, the hospital stay was interrupted. This happened in the middle of November, and now it's the first or second week of December. And the bulge is happening north of us, with the Germans coming through the bulge and with their sailor entering our area. So a message came down from higher up that said all walking wounded should be sent back to the line. Well, I'm walking wounded. So I was sent back to the line from the hospital, and I ended up in a replacement depot in preparation of sending me back to my company. And I was in the replacement depot for, it must have been at least a week, maybe longer. They were very good. I insisted, I asked if I could get back to my old unit. I didn't want to go as a replacement somewhere else. And they said yes. So after my time in the replacement depot, now it's the middle of January, I was transported back to my outfit, and now we're in the Maginot Line doing nothing except making rings, like wedding rings. And this was the craziest thing. The Maginot Line that we had, it was, concrete and 6 feet thick. And with a bunch of guys, we were doing nothing, but somebody discovered how to make wedding rings out of silver coins. Let me tell you how you do that. You take your silver coin, a little bit bigger than a $50, and there's plenty of French coins like that. And you put it on its edge, you take your spoon, and you very carefully wipe the edge with your spoon. And that sort of turns the edge over into a slight circle. Well, you get the idea, if you pound it enough, you end up looking like a heavy wedding ring with no hole. So you take your trench knife and you dig out the silver hole to match the size of your finger. And you can slide the silver wedding ring onto your finger. Now that's fine, except I'm in this damn bunker. It's dark, and the only light we have is cans with a wick, and you light the wick, and it's like a cigarette lighter. Gasoline, the wick, you light it, and you have a little lamp. And with this lamp, you make rings. And with 20 guys making rings, you go crazy. But that's what you do when you do nothing. Yeah. In the infantry, it's a funny thing. It's they say like, an hour of nothing and 2 minutes of panic. Yeah, and I see both. So that's it. Well, when I got back to the unit, we were in a static position, which means you're not doing anything. We were at the sheep farm, and we were there for 2 or 3 weeks, waiting for the go-ahead for the spring offensive. And during that time, we did little or nothing, which we were happy. We were in this place called the Sheep Farm. It was a beautiful rolling countryside in Germany. And we had this tree line, and 500 yards ahead, there was another tree line, and that's where the Germans were. So they stayed here, we stayed there, and we didn't shoot at each other. They didn't shoot at us, we didn't shoot at them. But every once in a while, our company commander got itchy, and he'd take a bunch of riflemen, and they go on a combat patrol at night. And they never asked of my group, which was the watermen, it was always the riflemen. I tell you, my hat goes off to those guys. The riflemen were really tough. They were the heroes. I like to think that I'm not a hero, but I served with heroes. Those guys were something. Anyhow, one night they went out on a combat patrol and they lost one guy. And they got back and they said, so-and-so was wounded, but we couldn't get him back. So the next day, the medical detachment from the battalion came down with a couple of their medics and a big white flag and a stretcher. And they waved this white flag on our side. And then they walked toward the German lines. And when they got about 25 yards out, they were told to halt, and they stopped. And the German came down and said, what do you want? And one of the guys, a lieutenant from a medical group, spoke Yiddish. So he was able to communicate in German. And he said, we've come for the wounded soldier from last night. And the German said, no, he died through the night. And they said, okay, can we have the body? He said, sure. So they went back and they got the GI on a blanket and they brought him out, put him on the litter, and the medics picked up the litter. The lieutenant gave his German a pack of cigarettes, and the German said something like, "You're very, very brave." It was, if they decided to be army, they'd kill those guys, but they didn't. So it worked out well. Yeah, that was a stable condition. Every night at the sheep farm, we'd all go back to the holes along the line to keep an eye out for Germans. And I went back with two of my buddies, and we slept the night in the hole, and we'd be on guard duty at the end of the base of the hole for 2 hours, while the other two guys were sleeping. So one guy got 4 hours of sleep and 2 hours on duty. Well, it was my turn to duty, and I'm there watching, looking, and I swear, I heard the entire German army pass in front of me. So I said, now every other hole, the holes were like 50 yards apart, and every other hole had a sound-powered telephone. And the sound-powered telephone didn't need batteries or anything, just the sound of your voice. I don't know how it did. Nothing else, and you could talk to other people. So I got on the phone, I said, I hear the whole German army passing in front of me. Turn on the moonlight. And I said, okay. So they sent that message all the way back to Corps headquarters, and they turned on the searchlights which are made specifically for picking up airplanes in the dark. But they've discovered that if they angle these things at night and hit a white cloud or cloud cover, the light bounces back down to Earth. And they were able to do that in my situation, and they lit up the entire landscape in front of me. And you know what? There weren't a German anywhere. So I got ribbed for that the next morning when we stopped for breakfast, and that was a fun time. It was an easy time, and then after that after 2 weeks of in reserve, as they called it, we were on trucks again, and then we ended up on the outskirts of Heilbronn, Germany, which turned out, we didn't know it, but it turned out to be one of the last battles of World War II for a German city. And we got to the Neckar River, which runs through Heilbronn, and we had to cross the Neckar. It's about 100 yards. It's not a big river, about 100 yards long. But we had to cross it. So the engineers, a half mile down the river, they would start to build a pontoon bridge. And every time they got it halfway out, the Germans, who could see all this from a place on the other side of the river, their artillery took it out. So the engineers decided that they didn't want to lose any more guys, so they gave up building a bridge, a pontoon bridge. But yet they brought up rowboats, which were really pontoons. And we had oars, and we jumped into these rowboats with oars, with an engineer in front calling the strokes, and we learned how to do the dragon boat routine across the Neckar River. But luckily, what they did, they called up from Corps, they called up a group of, a chemical group that had smoke machines. And this was an old black group. And then up until that time, I hadn't seen a black guy for months. But anyhow, they sent up this black group, and they laid down smoke. So when we got into our boats to do the dash across the Neckar, we did it in smoke. And we got across very nicely. So we got on the other side, and 12 days later, we completed the taking of this major city called Heilbronn, Germany. And from then on, we got onto then we got onto tanks, and we went into Germany as fast as the tanks could take us. We liberated town after town after town, and that was pretty much the end of the fighting for me.
I'm going to ask we'll take a few questions. How old were you? 19. Come in.
Wow.
I signed up at 18, and I was doing these things. I just turned 19 when all this happened.
Yes, sir.
Did you have any interactions with German citizens on your trip through Germany? What was that like?
Interactions with German citizens when he was going through?
No, not really. The first interaction, we took over a small German town, and the ladies there were no men, there were just ladies, and they obviously were very, very frightened. They didn't know that if we were going to act like they were told we would react, or that we would act like gentlemen, so to speak. Well, we acted like gentlemen. All we wanted was fried eggs. Which they did. And fresh eggs were not on the Army's schedule. So we had fresh eggs. It was very common. The first thing I learned in German was Haben Sie Eier? Have you any eggs?
Last Sunday, I actually went to my wife's uncle's birthday. If you remember last year, we had a guy who was 101 and presented. Well, he turned 102. So anyway, the other people the other relatives in the other room, and then one made a comment about, oh, gee, look at that old camera. So I said, hey, Bernie, where'd you get that camera? He said, oh, when we go in and liberate towns, we just loot everything. So everybody thought it was a nice camera, but it just took it.
Oh, yes, when we went through these different towns, the first thing that my sergeant did was tell the burgomaster, the mayor, all cameras and all weapons have to be turned in. Now, they interpreted weapons as anything that looked like it could kill you, including a sword that's 200 years old, which was this is a pile of swords in front of the burgomaster's house. And I said, here's my opportunity of getting some loot. So I went through these swords and I found a German dress sword, nondescript. It was a German dress, but I also got something that looked like a saber, and in close examination, it was a Russian Cossack sword. So here is a sword that some German got from a Cossack, brought back, and it ends up in a pile so we Americans can make it. Both these swords are in my. They're here in they're in Massachusetts, and they're going to be given to my grandson at an appropriate time. But the funny thing is, this Cossack sword, I didn't know it had a sign and a signal, the Russian thing, Russian logo. And it was a very inextensively, it was not a high class. This is not an officer's sword. This is just one of the guys. Years later, I saw an article with a picture of Russians having a meeting somewhere, and sure enough, this guy has my sword. I recognize the hilt. So it's a fine memorabilia of the times.
Other questions? Yes?
You said you put your shrapnel in your pocket. Do you still have it?
Does he still have his shrapnel?
Well, I had it with. Well, the answer is no. What happened? My son was showing my Purple Heart to a buddy of his one day, and the shrapnel was in that box.